The two pink lines seemed to pulse with each beat of her racing heart. At 20 years old, this wasn't part of her carefully laid plans. College, career, then maybe marriage, and kids somewhere down the line. The cheap plastic stick felt impossibly heavy as reality sank in. "Sarah?" James's voice came through the door, thick with concern. "You've been in there for 15 minutes. Are you okay?" She drew a shaky breath, her reflection in the mirror showing a pale face framed by disheveled honey-blonde hair. The words caught in her throat. How could she tell her boyfriend of 2 years that their lives were about to change forever? The worn linoleum floor creaked under her feet as she opened the door. James stood there, his dark eyes searching her face, still wearing his work uniform from the auto shop where he'd picked up extra shifts. At 21, he was already pulling double duty between there and the local hardware store, trying to save enough for them to move into a better apartment. "I'm pregnant," Sarah whispered, the words hanging in the air between them. James's eyes widened, and for a moment he stood frozen. Then, without warning, he wrapped her in a tight embrace, the familiar scent of motor oil and his favorite cologne, enveloping her. "We'll figure this out," he murmured into her hair. "Together." The next few weeks passed in a blur of morning sickness and secret worries. Sarah found herself constantly touching her still flat stomach, trying to wrap her mind around the tiny life growing inside her. Their small apartment, which had seemed cozy before, now felt suffocating as she imagined adding a crib and all the other necessities a baby would need. James threw himself into work with renewed vigor, picking up even more hours. Sarah would often wake in the middle of the night to find him hunched over their rickety kitchen table, surrounded by budget spreadsheets and parenting books borrowed from the library. The dark circles under his eyes matched her own, but he never complained. The first ultrasound appointment loomed like a beacon on their calendar. Sarah sat in the waiting room, her leg bouncing nervously as James held her hand. The medical office smelled of antiseptic and artificial lavender, and the soft murmur of conversations and occasional crying baby created a symphony of anxiety in her mind. "Sarah Mitchell?" a nurse called, leading them to an examination room decorated with posters of fetal development stages. The gel was cold on her stomach, and Sarah squeezed James's hand as the technician moved the wand across her abdomen. The grainy black and white image on the screen slowly came into focus, and the technician's expression changed. "Well," she said, adjusting the wand slightly, "this is interesting." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Is something wrong?" The technician smiled. "Not wrong at all, but I'm seeing 2 distinct heartbeats. Congratulations, you're having twins." The room seemed to spin as Sarah processed the news. Twins. Not 1 baby, but 2. She looked at James, whose face had gone slightly pale, but his grip on her hand remained steady. "Twins," he repeated, a mixture of terror and wonder in his voice. That evening, they sat on their second-hand couch, a pizza growing cold on the coffee table as they tried to process the day's revelation. Sarah had pulled up countless articles about twin pregnancies on her phone, each one adding to the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. "My sister has some baby stuff from when Tommy was born," James said, breaking the silence. "And my mom already said she'd help watch them while we're at work." Sarah set down her phone, turning to face him. "James, be honest with me. Are we crazy to think we can do this? We're barely more than kids ourselves." He was quiet for a moment, his face serious in the dim light of their apartment. "Maybe we are crazy," he admitted. "But I love you, and I already love these babies. We'll find a way." The next few weeks brought morning sickness that seemed to last all day, and Sarah found herself struggling to keep up with her classes at the community college. Her body felt foreign, changing, in ways she hadn't expected so early in the pregnancy. Simple tasks like climbing the stairs to their third-floor apartment left her winded, and the smell of certain foods, especially James's beloved garlic bread, sent her running for the bathroom. They decided to tell their families over a Sunday dinner at James's parents' house. His mother, Linda, had always been like a second mom to Sarah, especially since her own parents lived across the country. The familiar sounds of pots clanking in the kitchen and the warm aroma of Linda's famous pot roast filled the house as they gathered around the dining room table. "Mom, Dad," James started, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands under the table. "Sarah and I have some news." Linda's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and James's father, Robert, looked up from his plate. The ceiling fan whirred quietly overhead, marking the seconds of silence. "We're having twins," Sarah blurted out, unable to bear the tension any longer. The silence stretched for another moment before Linda burst into tears, rushing around the table to embrace them both. Robert sat stunned, his expression unreadable. "Twins," Linda repeated, wiping her eyes. "Oh my goodness. You do." As Sarah shared the details they'd learned at the ultrasound, she watched Robert's face soften. He stood up slowly, walking over to place a hand on James's shoulder. "Son," he said quietly, "this won't be easy. But you've got family behind. You whatever you need." Later that night, as they lay in bed, Sarah listened to the distant sound of traffic and the rhythmic breathing of James beside her. Her hands rested on her slightly rounded belly, and for the first time since seeing those two pink lines, she felt a glimmer of hope. They were young, maybe too young, but they weren't alone. The apartment walls were thin enough that she could hear their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, playing her nightly classical music. The gentle melody drifted through the darkness, and Sarah found herself imagining playing music for her babies, wondering if they could hear it yet. There was so much to learn, so much to prepare for, but in that quiet moment, she allowed herself to dream of tiny hands and first smiles. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a wave of nausea hit her with unexpected force. She barely made it to the bathroom in time, and as she knelt on the cold tile floor, she felt James's warm hand on her back, rubbing gentle circles. "I'm sorry," she whispered between heaves. "Don't be sorry," he murmured, holding her hair back. "We're in this together, remember." As the nausea subsided, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of their challenges. But with James's steady presence beside her and their family's support behind them, maybe, just maybe, they could handle whatever came next. What she didn't know, as she finally drifted off to sleep that night, was that the universe had much bigger plans for their little family than anyone could have imagined. The universe's plans began to reveal themselves on a crisp Thursday morning when Sarah woke to find her clothes fitting differently than they had just days before. Her small baby bump had seemed to expand overnight, stretching the fabric of her favorite sweater in ways that defied her understanding of normal pregnancy progression. The morning light filtering through their bedroom window cast strange shadows on her changing form as she examined herself in the full-length mirror propped against the wall. "James," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Does this look normal to you?" James emerged from their tiny bathroom, toothbrush still in hand, foam at the corners of his mouth. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance, and he quickly disappeared to spit and rinse before returning. "Wow," he managed, reaching out to touch her expanded middle. "That seems different from yesterday." The sensation of his warm hand on her belly triggered another wave of morning sickness, more intense than any before. Sarah barely made it to the bathroom, her knees hitting the tiles with a force that would leave bruises. As she heaved into the toilet, tears streaming down her face, she felt a strange flutter in her abdomen, not quite a kick, but something more than the usual movement she'd grown accustomed to. Their follow-up appointment wasn't scheduled for another week, but Sarah's intuition told her something was different. The clinic squeezed her in that afternoon, between a harried receptionist's apologetic explanations about their packed schedule. The waiting room felt smaller than before, the chairs more uncomfortable, and the magazines more outdated. A children's program played quietly on the mounted TV, its cheerful songs creating an odd soundtrack to Sarah's mounting anxiety. Dr. Reynolds, a maternal fetal medicine specialist with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, listened intently as Sarah described her concerns. The examination room's paper covering crinkled beneath her as she lay back on the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet space. "Let's take a look," Dr. Reynolds said, reaching for the ultrasound wand. The gel was warmer this time, but Sarah's heart felt colder as she watched the doctor's expression change from professional interest to surprise, then to careful neutrality. "Sarah, James," she began, her voice measured, "I'm seeing something unexpected here." She turned the monitor slightly, pointing to distinct shapes on the screen. "These are your twins, here and here." Her finger moved across the screen. "And these are two more babies." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah felt James's hand tighten around hers, his palms suddenly sweaty against her skin. "4?" he whispered, the word barely audible over the steady whoosh of multiple heartbeats filling the room. "Quadruplets," Dr. Reynolds confirmed, continuing to study the screen. "This is an extremely rare occurrence, especially in natural conception cases. I'm going to want to see you much more frequently now, and we'll need to discuss some significant changes to your care plan." The next hour passed in a blur of medical terminology and statistics, words like high risk, selective reduction, and neonatal intensive care swirled around them like autumn leaves in a storm. Sarah nodded mechanically as Dr. Reynolds explained the increased risks and necessary precautions, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating the cost of 4 car seats, imagining their tiny apartment crammed with 4 cribs, wondering how they could possibly afford 4 of everything on James's modest income. The drive home was silent, the car's engine providing a low hum that matched the buzzing in Sarah's head. James drove with both hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. At each red light, he would glance over, at her, opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again when no words came. Finally, parked outside their apartment building, Sarah broke down. The tears she'd been holding back since the doctor's office burst forth like a dam breaking, her whole body shaking with the force of her sobs. James quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and pulled her into his arms, awkwardly leaning across the center console. "I can't do this," she choked out between sobs. "4 babies, James, 4. We can barely afford one." He stroked her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. "We'll figure it out. We always do." "But how?" She pulled back to look at him, mascara streaking her cheeks. "You're already working 2 jobs. I'll have to drop out of school. And our apartment." She gestured helplessly at the building looming above them, with its broken elevator and temperamental heating system. James was quiet. For a moment, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "Remember when we first moved in here?" he asked suddenly. "Everyone said we were too young to live together, that we'd never make it work. But we did. We figured it out then, and we'll figure this out now." That evening, they sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of budget calculations and lists of essential baby items. Mrs. Chen from next door had heard Sarah crying earlier and brought over a pot of her famous soup, its aromatic steam filling their apartment with the comforting scents of ginger and star anise. The familiar smell somehow made their impossible situation feel slightly more manageable. "Okay," James said, running a hand through his dark hair for the 100th time that evening. "If I pick up weekend shifts at the shop and maybe look for some online work I can do at night." Sarah reached across the table to still his restless hands. "You can't work 24 hours a day, James. You'll kill yourself." He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I'll do whatever it takes to take care of our family." The word family hung in the air between them, taking on new weight and meaning. 4 babies, 4 tiny lives depending on them. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and awe-inspiring. A soft knock at their door interrupted their planning session. Linda stood in the hallway, holding several large shopping bags. "I hope you don't mind," she said, stepping inside, "but I couldn't sleep thinking about you 2 trying to handle all this alone." The bags contained second-hand baby clothes, carefully washed and folded, along with parenting books and a thick envelope that Sarah discovered was filled with cash, Linda and Robert's vacation fund, now repurposed for their grandchildren. "Mom, we can't accept this," James protested, but Linda silenced him with a look that only mothers can perfect. "Family takes care of family," she said firmly, beginning to unpack the bags. "Now, let me show you how to properly fold these onesies. You'll want to be efficient with 4 babies to dress." As Linda demonstrated her folding technique, sharing stories about when James was a baby, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The flutter she'd felt that morning returned, stronger now, as if the babies were responding to their grandmother's voice. She pressed a hand to her expanding belly, and for the first time since hearing the news about the quadruplets, she felt a spark of excitement cutting through her fear. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah sat by their bedroom window, watching. The city lights twinkle in the distance. James's gentle snoring provided a comforting backdrop to her thoughts as she absent-mindedly rubbed her belly. The babies seemed more active at night, their movements becoming more pronounced with each passing day. "Hello, little ones," she whispered into the darkness. "I don't know how we're going to do this, but I promise we'll figure it out. Daddy and I, we love you already. All four of you." A car alarm went off somewhere in the distance, its harsh wailing cutting through the night. Sarah watched as lights flicked on in neighboring buildings, shadows moving behind curtains as other lives intersected with hers in this moment of quiet contemplation. She thought about all the other mothers-to-be out there, wondering if any of them felt as overwhelmed and unprepared as she did. The next few days brought a flurry of activity. Their small apartment became a hub of planning and preparation as family members and friends rallied around them. Sarah's best friend, Emma, set up a crowdfunding page, sharing their story with local community groups. James's co-workers at both jobs organized a baby supply drive. Even Mrs. Chen contributed, teaching Sarah how to make natural remedies for morning sickness and offering to knit baby blankets. But as their support system grew, so did the physical demands of carrying 4 babies. Sarah found herself exhausted by the simplest tasks, her body changing more rapidly than she thought possible. The morning sickness, which had begun to subside with the twins, returned with renewed intensity. She developed an aversion to the smell of coffee, forcing James to drink his morning cup on their small balcony, regardless of the weather. During her next checkup, Dr. Reynolds noticed something concerning in Sarah's blood pressure readings. "I want you on modified bed rest," she announced, holding up a hand to forestall Sarah's protests. "I know it's not ideal, but with quadruplets, we need to be extra cautious. Your body is doing the work of 5 people right now." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Just when they needed money the most, she would be unable to work. She lay in bed that night, listening to James practice, his pitch for a promotion at the auto shop, his voice carrying through their thin walls as he rehearsed in the bathroom mirror. But there was something else bothering her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The way the babies moved felt different somehow, more coordinated, as if they were running out of room much faster than they should be. She made a mental note to mention it at her next appointment, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to her unusual pregnancy than even their doctors realized. What she didn't know then, as she finally drifted off to sleep with James's arm protectively wrapped around her growing belly, was that their journey was about to take an even more extraordinary turn. The universe, it seemed, wasn't done surprising them yet. The universe revealed its next surprise on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning when Sarah woke to find her maternity clothes, purchased just days before, already straining at the seams. The gentle patter of raindrops against their bedroom window provided a steady rhythm to match her racing heartbeat as she struggled to sit up in bed, her enlarged belly making every movement a carefully calculated exercise. "James," she called out, her voice wavering. "Something's not right." Through the bathroom door she could hear the shower running and James singing off-key to some pop song on the radio, a morning ritual that usually made her smile. Today, however, panic clawed at her throat as she felt unusual movements within her abdomen, like a complex dance choreographed by multiple participants. When James emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist and steam billowing behind him, he stopped short at the sight of her. Sarah sat perched on the edge of their bed, her hands cradling her dramatically expanded midsection, tears streaming down her face. "Call Dr. Reynolds," she whispered. "Please." The drive to the hospital was a blur of windshield wipers, traffic lights, and mounting anxiety. James had called in sick to both jobs, something he'd never done before, and the gravity of that simple act hung heavy in the car's humid air. The rain had intensified, turning the city into a watercolor painting of greys and blues, streetlights reflecting off puddles like scattered stars. In the hospital's maternal fetal medicine unit, Dr. Reynolds's usual composed demeanor cracked slightly as she conducted the ultrasound. The room was unusually crowded. 3 additional specialists had been called in, their whispered consultations creating a nervous undercurrent beneath the steady rhythm of multiple heartbeats. "Sarah, James," Dr. Reynolds finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "What I'm about to tell you is unprecedented." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "We're not seeing 4 babies anymore." Sarah's grip on James's hand tightened to the point of pain. "Did we—" She couldn't finish the sentence, fear choking off her words. "No, no," Dr. Reynolds quickly reassured her. "They're all there, plus 6 more. You're carrying 10 babies." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Sarah heard a strange ringing in her ears, and James's legs gave out, forcing him to sit heavily in the chair behind him. 10 babies. The number echoed in her mind like a bell tolling. "This is the largest naturally conceived multiple pregnancy ever documented," one of the other specialists explained, his excitement barely contained. "It's scientifically fascinating, but also extremely high risk." The next few hours dissolved into a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and difficult conversations. Words like selective reduction were mentioned again, causing Sarah to curl protectively around her enormous belly, shaking her head vehemently. Despite the risks, despite the odds, she couldn't bear the thought of choosing which of her babies wouldn't have a chance at life. By the time they left the hospital, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world that seemed somehow cleaner, fresher, but also fundamentally changed. The car ride home was silent except for the sound of their breathing and the occasional sniffle from Sarah as she tried to process their new reality. 10, James finally said as they sat in their parking spot, neither making a move to get out of the car. 10 babies. That's a baseball team. The absurdity of the statement broke through Sarah's shock, and she found herself laughing through her tears. "With a backup player," she added, hiccuping slightly. James turned to her, his face a complex mixture of terror and determination. "We're going to need a bigger apartment." That evening, their tiny living room filled with family members called in for an emergency meeting. Linda sat on the couch, clutching Robert's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Emma perched on the arm of the recliner, her laptop open as she frantically researched multiple birth statistics. Even Mrs. Chen had been invited, bringing with her a pot of specially prepared herbs meant to strengthen Sarah's constitution. 10 babies, Linda repeated for the 100th time, shaking her head in wonder. "My God. We'll need to move them in with us," Robert announced, his voice brooking no argument. "Our house has enough room if we convert the garage, and Linda can help with the babies while you two work." "Dad, we can't possibly—" James began, but Robert cut him off. "Son, this isn't about pride anymore. This is about survival. 10 babies. That's not just a challenge, that's a logistical nightmare. You'll need all the help you can get." As if to emphasize his point, Sarah suddenly gasped, pressing a hand to her side. The babies were especially active tonight, their movements visible through her stretched skin. Everyone watched in fascinated horror as ripples moved across her belly like waves on a stormy sea. Emma looked up from her laptop, her face pale. "According to everything I can find, this is unprecedented. The current record for naturally conceived multiples is 8, and even that's extremely rare. The media is going to go crazy when this gets out." She was right. By the next morning, their story had leaked to local news outlets. By lunchtime, national networks were calling. By dinner, their apartment building was surrounded by news vans, reporters calling up to their window like modern-day Romeos, begging for interviews. James handled the media attention with unexpected grace, agreeing to one exclusive interview with a reputable network in exchange for their help managing the growing circus outside. Sarah watched from their bed, now officially confined to complete bed rest, as her boyfriend transformed into a spokesperson for their unprecedented situation. "We're just taking it one day at a time," she heard him tell the interviewer in their living room. "Our main concern is keeping Sarah and the babies healthy. Everything else is secondary." The interview aired that evening, and their story exploded across social media. Offers of help poured in from around the world, everything from baby supplies to suggestions for names. Companies wanted sponsorship deals, reality TV producers pitched show concepts, and charitable organizations reached out with support. It was overwhelming, but also heartening to see so much kindness from strangers. A local furniture store donated 10 cribs. A car dealership offered them a heavily discounted passenger van. Their crowdfunding page, originally set up to help with basic supplies, had reached 6 figures and was still climbing. But amid the chaos and publicity, Sarah found herself increasingly focused inward, listening to her body and the messages it was trying to send her. Something felt different, beyond the expected challenges of carrying 10 babies. There was a pressure building, a sensation she couldn't quite explain to her doctors. Late one night, as James slept in the recliner beside their bed, the only way he could sleep now, wanting to be close enough to help her at a moment's notice, Sarah lay awake watching moonlight create patterns on their ceiling. She felt each of her babies move, learning to distinguish their different patterns and rhythms. There was the quiet one who only moved late at night, the energetic one who seemed to be practicing gymnastics, the pair that always moved in sync. "Listen," she whispered to her unborn children, "I know this isn't going to be easy for any of us, but we're all in this together and we have so many people ready to help us, so just stay strong, stay healthy, we'll figure out the rest as we go." A gentle kick, from which baby she wasn't sure, seemed to answer her words. Sarah smiled, placing her hand over the spot. But then another sensation washed over her, different from anything she'd felt before. A cramping pain that made her breath catch in her throat. "James," she called out, her voice tight with fear. "James, wake up." He was instantly alert, years of living paycheck to paycheck having trained him to wake at a moment's notice for early shifts. "What's wrong?" "I think—" Sarah paused as another wave of pain hit her. "I think something's happening. It's too early, James, it's way too early." The fear in her voice spurred him into action. Within minutes he had her in the car, breaking several traffic laws as they sped toward the hospital. Sarah clutched her belly, whispering desperate prayers to whatever higher power might be listening. The universe, having already demonstrated its penchant for surprises in their lives, was about to reveal its most dramatic twist yet. As they rushed through the emergency room doors, neither Sarah nor James could have imagined the extraordinary events that were about to unfold, events that would test their strength, their love, and their faith in ways they never thought possible. The emergency room doors hissed shut behind them as a team of medical professionals descended upon Sarah like a well-choreographed dance troupe. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her pain-contorted face as she was quickly transferred to a wheelchair, James running alongside as they rushed her through sterile corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. 26 weeks, Dr. Reynolds announced as she burst through the doors, having been summoned from her home in the middle of the night. Her usually perfectly styled hair was hastily pulled back, and she wore running shoes with her scrubs, small details Sarah's mind latched onto as she tried to distract herself from the increasing waves of pain. "Get the NICU team on standby, all of them." The labor and delivery floor transformed into a command center. Nurses rushed back and forth, pushing equipment into an operating room large enough to accommodate the unprecedented situation. The clicking of their shoes against the linoleum floor created a frantic percussion beneath the steady beeping of monitors and the squeak of gurney wheels. "Sarah, listen to me carefully," Dr. Reynolds said, her face appearing in Sarah's narrowing field of vision. "Your body is showing signs of severe preeclampsia. The babies are in distress. We need to perform an emergency C-section immediately." James's face went pale, his hand trembling as he stroked Sarah's sweat-dampened hair. "But it's too early," he protested, his voice cracking. "They're too small. If we don't deliver now, we risk losing all of them, including Sarah," another doctor interjected, his voice gentle but firm. "The NICU team is ready. We've assembled the best specialists available." The operating room was a blur of activity as Sarah was prepped for surgery. The cold antiseptic smell burned her nostrils as nurses efficiently attached monitors and inserted IVs. Through it all, she could feel her babies moving, their movements becoming more frantic, as if they too sensed the urgency of the situation. "James," she whispered as they prepared to administer the spinal block, "I'm scared." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, his surgical mask catching their mingled tears. "I know, baby. Me too. But you're the strongest person I know. You can do this. We can do this." The anesthesia team worked quickly, and soon Sarah felt the strange sensation of numbness spreading through her lower body. A blue surgical drape was raised, creating a barrier between her and the surgical field. James sat by her head, still, holding her hand, his other hand gently stroking her cheek. "All right, Sarah," Dr. Reynolds called from behind the drape. "We're beginning now. You'll feel some pressure but no pain. Just try to stay calm and breathe." The pressure she mentioned felt like mountains being moved inside Sarah's body. The room fell into a focused silence, broken only by the necessary communication between medical staff and the steady beeping of monitors. Then, at 3:47 a.m., the first cry pierced the air, tiny but determined. "Baby A is out," Dr. Reynolds announced, "a girl being taken to NICU Team 1. Sarah caught a glimpse of something impossibly small being whisked away to a waiting incubator, where a team of specialists immediately began working. Before she could process it, Dr. Reynolds was announcing the arrival of baby B, another girl. The deliveries continued, each baby immediately surrounded by their own dedicated medical team. The room had been divided into stations, each with the equipment necessary to stabilize a premature infant. 3 boys and 7 girls in total, each weighing less than 2 pounds, each fighting for their first breaths in a world they weren't quite ready to enter. But as Dr. Reynolds continued the surgery, her experienced hands moving with practiced precision, she suddenly paused. "There's something else here," she said, her voice tense. "Get me an ultrasound, now." The portable ultrasound machine was quickly positioned, and Dr. Reynolds studied the screen with intense concentration. "It's not another baby," she finally announced. "It's a tumor, large one. No wonder Sarah's been having such severe symptoms. Prep for tumor removal. This could explain the unusual hormone levels that might have contributed to the multiple conception." The surgery stretched on as the skilled surgical team worked to remove the tumor while ensuring Sarah's safety. James never left her side, whispering words of encouragement, even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. Through the numbness, Sarah could feel the tugging and pressure as they worked, her mind racing with questions about her babies, barely processing the news about the tumor. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Dr. Reynolds stepped back from the operating table. "Tumor's out, closure beginning. Sarah, you did amazingly well. All 10 babies are with the NICU teams now." As the surgical team began closing, Sarah could hear the organized chaos beyond the drape. 10 teams of medical professionals working to stabilize 10 tiny lives. The sounds of equipment beeping, urgent but quiet conversations, and occasionally, blessedly, the thin cries of her newborns filled the room. "James," Dr. Reynolds called out, "would you like to see your children while we finish here?" He looked at Sarah, who nodded weakly. "Go," she whispered. "Tell me about them." James moved between the NICU stations, his steps unsteady as he took in the sight of his 10 premature children. Each one was smaller than his hand, their skin nearly translucent, their tiny bodies connected to a web of monitors and tubes. But each one was fighting, their miniature chests rising and falling with helped breaths, their microscopic fingers occasionally twitching. He returned to Sarah's side, tears streaming freely down his face. "They're beautiful," he choked out. "So small but so perfect, and they're fighters just like their mama." The next few hours passed in a blur as Sarah was moved to recovery, and the babies were transferred to the NICU. The tumor was sent to pathology, though Dr. Reynolds was optimistic it was benign. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, the combination of medication and exhaustion pulling her under, but each time she surfaced, James was there. Linda and Robert arrived just before dawn, their faces showing the strain of their middle-of-the-night drive to the hospital. They found James in the NICU, standing between the rows of incubators that housed his children, looking shell-shocked. 10 grandchildren, Linda whispered, wrapping her arms around her son. 10 little miracles. Robert stood silent, taking in the scene before him. Finally, he cleared his throat. We'll need a bigger house than we thought. The comment broke through James's days, and he let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Dad, how are we going to do this? They're so small, so fragile. The same way you've handled everything else life has thrown at you, Robert replied, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. One day at a time, with your family behind you. In the recovery room, Sarah finally regained full consciousness as the morning sun began to peek through the windows. Her body felt like it had been through a war, which in a way it had, but her first thought was of her babies. They're holding their own, the recovery nurse assured her, noting her questioning look. All 10 of them. The NICU team says they're showing fighting spirits, must run in the family. Sarah closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer of thanks. They had a long road ahead of them, months in the NICU, challenges she couldn't even begin to imagine, and a complete restructuring of the life they had planned. But they had taken the first, most critical step. Her babies were alive. What? She didn't know then, as she drifted back to sleep with the weight of her now empty belly and the ache of her healing body, was that their story was far from over. The universe, having delivered its biggest surprise yet, wasn't finished testing their strength, their love, and their determination to beat the odds. The universe's next test arrived in the form of endless beeping monitors, countless medical procedures, and the agonizing reality of not being able to hold their newborns. The NICU became Sarah and James's second home, its stringent routines, marking the passage of time more reliably than any calendar. Each morning began the same way, thorough hand-washing at the NICU entrance, donning fresh hospital gowns, and the quiet walk past 10 incubators, checking on each tiny life that depended on them. The babies, whom they'd begun identifying by the letters assigned during delivery while still contemplating permanent names, fought their own battles behind clear plastic walls. Baby A had a good night, the night shift nurse would report, her voice hushed in the dimly lit unit. She's maintaining her temperature better, and her oxygen levels are steady. Each positive report felt like a small victory, each setback a devastating blow. Sarah, still recovering from her surgery, spent hours in a rocking chair positioned strategically between the incubators. The physical pain of her C-section and tumor removal paled in comparison to the emotional agony of seeing her children struggling to survive. Each baby was smaller than a pound of butter, their skin so translucent that their veins created delicate blue maps across their bodies. James had taken a leave of absence from both jobs, thanks to the unexpected financial support that had poured in from around the world. Their story had captured hearts globally, and the crowdfunding campaign Emma had started had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Local news stations parked outside the hospital hoping for updates, while social media buzzed with messages of support and prayer. "Look at baby D," James whispered one afternoon, his face pressed close to an incubator. "She grabbed my finger today." The milestone, though small, brought tears to his eyes. Each tiny achievement, a stronger heartbeat, an ounce gained, successful feeding, became cause for celebration. The NICU staff had never handled decuplets before, but they adapted with remarkable efficiency. Each baby had their own primary care team, and the nurses had developed a color-coding system to keep track of medications, feeding schedules, and developmental progress. Charts lined the walls, tracking 10 different journeys toward health and strength. Linda visited daily, often bringing home-cooked meals that she practically forced Sarah and James to eat. "You can't take care of them if you don't take care of yourselves," she would insist, unpacking containers of nutritious food. She had taken charge of coordinating the home front, working with Robert to prepare their house for eventually welcoming 10 newborns. The tumor pathology results came back benign, as Dr. Reynolds had hoped, but its presence helped explain the unprecedented multiple pregnancy. "It was creating a perfect storm of hormones," she explained during a follow-up consultation. "The chances of this happening again are essentially zero." Sarah found herself laughing at that. "Thank goodness. I think 10 is plenty." Days blended into weeks as they settled into their new routine. Each morning brought new challenges. Baby C needed additional respiratory support. Baby G wasn't gaining weight as quickly as hoped. Baby H had a minor infection scare. But there were triumphs too. Baby B opened her eyes for the first time. Baby E was strong enough for his first attempt at kangaroo care. Baby J showed remarkable progress with breathing on her own. The first time Sarah was allowed to hold one of her babies, Baby A, the firstborn, was a moment of pure magic, tinged with fear. The nurse helped position the tiny infant, still connected to monitors and tubes against Sarah's bare chest. The contact was meant to help regulate the baby's temperature and breathing, but Sarah felt it healing something in her own soul as well. "She's so small," she whispered, afraid to move a muscle. The baby, weighing just over 2 pounds now, felt lighter than air against her skin. "But she's strong," the nurse assured her. "They all are. We've never seen decuplets before, but these babies are writing their own survival story." James took pictures of the moment, his hands shaking, slightly as he tried to capture the perfect angle. These photos would join the growing collection on their private blog, where they shared updates with family and close friends. The public's fascination with their story hadn't waned, but they were determined to keep some moments just for themselves. The NICU became a world of its own, with its own language and rhythm. Words like bradycardia, desaturation, and gavage feeding became part of their daily vocabulary. They learned to read monitors before looking at their babies' faces, to interpret every beep and alarm, to understand the complex dance of medical interventions that kept their children alive. Other NICU parents became unexpected allies in their journey. There was an unspoken understanding among them, a shared experience of watching their children fight for survival. The parents of twins or triplets would often stop by, offering encouragement and understanding, though none could fully comprehend the magnitude of caring for 10 premature babies. One evening, as Sarah and James sat between the incubators during the quiet night shift, they finally began discussing names. They had been waiting, afraid to become too attached when the future was so uncertain, but their babies were growing, stronger each day. "I think we should give them strong names," James said, watching baby F stretch her tiny arms. "Names that reflect what fighters they are." Sarah nodded, her hand resting on baby C's incubator. But also beautiful names, names that tell their story. They spent hours whispering possibilities to each other, weighing the significance of each choice. These names would carry the weight of their children's extraordinary beginning, would tell the story of their fight for survival. The naming process became a way to claim normalcy in their extraordinary situation. It was something all parents did, this careful choosing of names, this imagining of futures. For a few hours, they weren't the parents of miracle decuplets. They were just a young couple dreaming about their children's lives. But reality was never far away. Each incubator still beeped. Each tiny chest still struggled for breath. Each gram gained was still celebrated like Olympic gold. The universe had given them 10 miracles, but it demanded constant vigilance in return. Late that night, after James had fallen asleep in the recliner beside her, Sarah made her rounds of the incubators one last time. She spoke to each baby in turn, sharing secrets and promises, her words mixing with the rhythmic sounds of medical equipment. "You're all so loved," she whispered to baby J, the smallest of the 10. "We have so many people waiting to meet you, so many arms ready to hold you. You just need to keep fighting." What she didn't know then, as she finally settled back in her chair for a few hours of restless sleep, was that their NICU journey would test their resilience in ways they never imagined. The universe, having blessed them with 10 miracles, would demand proof that they were worthy of such extraordinary gifts. The universe's test of worthiness began the very next morning, when baby J's monitor alarmed at 4:37 a.m. The shrill sound cut through the quiet NICU like a knife, bringing the night shift running. Sarah jerked awake in her chair, her heart racing, as she watched the medical team surround her smallest child's incubator. "Oxygen saturation dropping," a nurse called out, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "Bradycardia." Sarah felt James's hand slip into hers as they watched, helpless while the team worked to stabilize their tiniest fighter. Baby J, weighing just 1 pound 4 ounces, had always been the most fragile of the 10. Her transparent skin seemed to glow under the bright medical lights as doctors and nurses moved with practiced efficiency. "Come on, little one," Sarah whispered, her free hand pressed against the incubator's clear wall. "Fight." And fight she did. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Baby J's stats began to stabilize. The crisis passed, but it left behind a new level of awareness about just how precarious their situation was. 10 babies meant 10 times the possibilities for complications, 10 times the chances for something to go wrong. Dr. Reynolds arrived early that morning, having been called about the incident. She found Sarah and James still stationed by Baby J's incubator, their young faces showing the strain of their sleepless night. "She's stronger than she looks," Dr. Reynolds assured them, reviewing the baby's charts. "They all are. But I think it's time we had a serious discussion about the next phase of their care." The next phase turned out to be a complex orchestration of specialists, therapies, and developmental interventions. Each baby would need individualized care plans, taking into account their unique challenges and strengths. The logistics were mind-boggling, but Sarah and James absorbed every detail, determined to be equal to the task. "We're going to start with kangaroo care for all of them," the NICU coordinator explained, showing them a schedule that looked more like a military operation plan. "Each baby will have designated time against your skin. It's crucial for their development." The schedule meant that Sarah and James would need to be present in the NICU for most of the day, trading off babies every few hours. It was exhausting, physically and emotionally, but the benefits were undeniable. The baby's vital signs improved during these sessions, their tiny bodies seeming to recognize their parents' touch. Linda and Robert had transformed their home in preparation for the baby's eventual homecoming. The garage had been converted into a state-of-the-art nursery, complete with hospital-grade monitoring equipment donated by a medical supply company. That had been moved by their story. The local community had rallied around them, with volunteers signing up to help once the babies were strong enough to leave the hospital. "Look at this," Emma said one afternoon, showing Sarah her laptop screen. During a brief break between kangaroo care sessions, the crowdfunding page had exceeded all expectations, reaching a sum that would allow them to hire professional help for the first year. "People really want you guys to succeed." The support was overwhelming, but so were the expectations that came with it. Their story had become a symbol of hope for many, and Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility. She was no longer just a 20-year-old trying to survive an impossible situation. She was a mother whose every decision would affect 10 precious lives. James threw himself into learning everything he could about premature infant care. He attended every training session offered by the NICU staff, took detailed notes during doctor's rounds, and spent his rare free moments researching on his phone. His dedication impressed even the most experienced nurses. "You're a natural," one of them commented, as she watched him carefully positioning baby E for kangaroo care. "Most parents are terrified to handle preemies this small." "Oh, I'm terrified," James admitted with a small laugh. "I just can't let that stop me. They need us." As the weeks passed, each baby began developing their own personality. Baby A, the firstborn, was calm and observant, her dark eyes following movement around her incubator. Baby D was the most vocal, her tiny cries demanding attention whenever she was awake. Baby H was the wiggler, constantly moving despite the tubes and wires surrounding her. Sarah started keeping a journal, documenting each baby's progress and milestones. "I want them to know their story someday," she explained to James as she wrote late one night. How hard they fought, how much they were loved from the very beginning. The journal entries became a way to process the emotional roller coaster of their days. Some entries were tear-stained, written after particularly difficult moments. Others were filled with joy, celebrating victories like baby C's first attempt at breathing without assistance, or baby G finally reaching 2 pounds. The naming ceremony, when it finally happened, was intimate despite the media attention their story had attracted. Each baby received their name in a quiet moment between their parents, the choices reflecting both their journey and their hopes for the future. "Hope," Sarah whispered to baby A, touching her tiny hand through the incubator port, "because you led the way for your siblings." "Faith," James murmured to baby B, "because that's what got us through the darkest nights." One by one, they named their children, each name carrying its own weight of meaning and prayer. Grace, joy, destiny, miracle, blessing, trinity, heaven, angel, and finally, for baby J, the smallest fighter, they chose serenity. The names seemed to give the babies new strength, or perhaps it was just their natural resilience showing through. Either way, their progress began to accelerate. The doctors spoke cautiously of eventual discharge dates, though they stressed that it would be a gradual process. "We'll likely send them home 1 or 2 at a time," Dr. Reynolds explained during a family meeting. "As each baby meets the criteria for discharge, it could take several weeks or even months between the first and last baby going home." The prospect of splitting up the babies was difficult to accept, but Sarah and James understood the necessity. They began preparing for the logistics of having babies in 2 locations, knowing they would need to divide their time between the NICU and home. Late one night, as Sarah sat between the incubators, doing her final checks before trying to sleep, she felt a peculiar sense of peace settle over her. The steady beeping of monitors had become a lullaby, the sight of 10 tiny chests rising and falling, a prayer answered 10 times over. "We're going to make it," she whispered to her sleeping children, "all of us together." What she didn't know then, as she finally allowed herself to believe in their future, was that the universe had one more lesson to teach them about strength, love, and the power of family. Their journey was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next.